Hey, Twisted listeners, I'm Cindy, and this is Twisted Listers, a podcast about murder and lists. And this is a Patreon episode I'm going to go ahead and do because Diva and I just couldn't find time to record this past week, but we still wanted to put some content out. So I thought I would do a solo one as promised, a little bit more Patreon content coming at you guys. My apologies for the slight vocal fry. I am recording early in the morning and trying to not wake anybody else up in my house. It's Sunday at 6:30 a.m. Anyway, this is the story of Patrick Drum, otherwise known as the Clallam County Vigilante. I took a lot of the information I have about him from The Atlantic. There's a pretty good article about him. I did some other research as well, but if anybody wants to read more, you can check out The Atlantic's article called The Vigilante of Clallam County. So, anyway, let's get into it. So, Patrick Drum was born and mostly raised in Port Angeles, Washington. He was born in 1978, grew up in a pretty shitty home. More on that later, but I just wanted to kind of set the scene. Now, Port Angeles, which is located, as I said, in Clallam County, may sound familiar if you've ever read or watched any Twilight books or movies. And in fact, for a time, the area became pretty popular among tourists. But after the Twilight frenzy died down, things went back to being pretty sleepy. So they had a brief moment of, some tourist money kind of injected into the economy, and that fell by the wayside. And they went back to being kind of a sleepy town, not a ton of, economy up there, lots of homes that like weren't super great. So Patrick did not live a life unlike many of the people in the area. There's definitely good families, of course, but I'm just saying it's not like living, in Beverly Hills. So after the Twilight frenzy died down, like I said, things went back to being sleepy. The town, even as of 2024 or 2023, has about 22,000 residents. So definitely not a big city, not a rich city. And it's Port Angeles is like the biggest city in the area. So in 2020, the median income was about $53,000. It's also very cold. In the middle of summer, the highs are around 70. So not a warm place. Everywhere has heat waves, but generally speaking, we're talking cold and cloudy most of the time, which is like honestly my least favorite weather. So both before and after Twilight, there wasn't a ton of tourism in the area, and this is why. So, anyway, that's a little history about the city. As I mentioned, Patrick had a hard life growing up, spent a lot of time in and out of prison on drug charges, which we won't even get into how backwards that is, obviously. People who have issues with drugs should be put in programs, but there you go. So, during his time in the drug scene, he met and befriended a woman named Leslie Sheriff, and the two would do drugs together from time to time. They also bonded while they were in rehab together, which is definitely where drug users should be. Sometime in the, I think, early 2000s, Leslie met a man named Gary Blanton, who was also in the drug scene, but was in and out of prison for violent reasons, not really maybe drug related, but the point is he tended towards violence. At one point, Leslie and Gary together were arrested for kidnapping after taking a teen girl against her will and holding her hostage in their apartment, hitting her with frying pans as well as their own hands for multiple hours. Now, I don't know why they did this. I could not find information as to what the cause of this was. Were they just doing it for fun? Does Gary want to, sexually assault this person? I don't know. I do know that, you know, got them both, in a lot of trouble. They both went to prison. Weirdly, and again, because I don't have information, it's hard for me to know why, but weirdly, Leslie actually ended up with the harsher sentence, which is strange. So when they were both finally released, because they were, I think Leslie did like 8 years or something. She went in when she was around like 20. Anyway, they married and later had two kids. For now, we're still in the mid 2000s. So during the time that, Leslie and Gary are living their worst life, Patrick was also kind of following the same trajectory. His offenses were all drug related, not violent necessarily, at least from what I could find. And when he was released for the last time in 2009, he decided to try to get his life together. At 31 years old at this point, he still had plenty of time to turn things around. And he did just that, honestly, at least outwardly. So first he got a job as a dishwasher while he was living in like a halfway house. They like release people to halfway homes if they don't have anywhere to go once they're out of prison. So he was living in this kind of shelter. He got a job as a dishwasher. From there, he ended up getting a pretty solid job as a farm laborer for a natural foods grocer in the area. This is definitely like a very Pacific Northwest thing to like have like hippie grocery stores that have like their own farms and it's like co-op style. It would also make sense that they would hire people out of prison programs, which is great. But for people who are like, what the hell, like this, grocery store has their own farm, like, yeah, it's totally a thing in the Pacific Northwest, to kind of have, local sourcing and kind of like the grocery store owns the farm and it's this whole big kind of like inclusive thing. So anyway, he's working at this job. He also started trying to interact with and influence at-risk youth in the area, which I really thought was cool because it was like a very like pure reason. Like he wasn't doing it for any horrible reason. If anybody's like, "Oh my god, what's going to happen to kids?" This isn't about kids. Well, it kind of is, but not in the way you think. He started taking classes at a local community college, and while there, he started a boxing team, mentoring youth with talent who wanted to excel in the sport. He kept coaching these kids even after he left the school, and he also unofficially mentored teens in the area, including two boys in particular who we will talk more about later. He would often take these boys fishing or to the mall or just to hang out. My assumption is they didn't have a great home life because, like, I would never let some, like, random ex prison convict dude, like, take my son somewhere, even when he's a teenager. Like, not gonna fucking happen. But however, it was allowed to happen. He was, in fact, a very good influence on these kids and seemed to care about them quite a lot. Now, I mentioned Leslie and Gary and how they're married with two still very young children, both, I think, under 3 years old at this time, like 2011, 2012. They really had them like back to back. Like they were very, very close in age. The two had an okay relationship. I think Leslie was very loyal to Gary, and Gary was kind of a shitbag, just to put it plainly. Patrick stayed in pretty close touch with the two of them, coming by for dinner here and there. They were friends. He found out that Gary had when he was 17, but still, he had gone to juvie or probably prison. I think they put them in prison at that age for statutory rape for having sex with a younger 17-year-old who happened to also be deaf and mute. So Gary and Leslie are both like, well, he didn't do anything wrong. They were both 17. But to Patrick, he's like, you took advantage of somebody and they were still a child. Like, what the fuck? Now, Leslie, who will forever defend Gary, said that this girl set him up to be arrested. And I'm like, I don't really think, especially at 17 years old, that that's like a thing. That feels like some stupid fucking excuse. But that gives you kind of an idea of the mindset of Leslie where Gary is concerned. Like, he's her man, like, very stand by your man, kind of deal, which I don't love. So anyway, he ended up in prison as a result, and once Patrick learned this, he stopped coming around as often, even though, like, I don't know, again, like, it's two 17-year-olds, but I don't know, it's hard to say. But anyway, Patrick didn't love this, so he started to keep his distance a bit more, and maybe it was also that Gary was a piece of shit in general. So even though Leslie, credits him for helping her turn her life around, I mean, the reason she went to prison is because she kidnapped somebody with him. So, like, the way that she's framing it, in interviews, it doesn't make a lot of sense. He's kind of a piece of shit. And in fact, in 2011, their 17-month-old son, Skylar, ended up in the hospital with a spiral fracture in his arm. This could have only happened if he either had a bone disorder, which he did not, or had been grabbed violently while he was laying down, which we all know which it was. And in case there's any doubt, doctors also found a 2-week-old fracture in his thigh. So there was abuse going on for sure. And the doctors actually reported it as such. And Gary was arrested for child abuse, which he, of course, denied. But, like, come on. He was released on bail, but was not allowed to go home or anywhere near the children until his court date. And Leslie was like, come on home, you're perfect, and I'm just going to defend you blindly. But police and social workers were like, you stay the fuck away from the kids until your court date. So instead, he went and stayed with a mutual friend of his and Patrick's named Mandy. While he was there, Gary had absolutely no respect for Mandy. He was just, would like eat her food. He would just talk shit to her. Like, this woman is giving him a place to stay so that he's not homeless. And he's just completely disrespecting her because this is the kind of person that Gary Blanton is. Now, Patrick witnessed this and actually got into a physical fight with Gary at Mandy's house. Mandy called Leslie to ask what she should do, but the two calmed down. And in fact, in the end, Patrick was like, "Hey, Gary, why don't you come stay with me?" This was likely to get him away from Mandy so she could kind of have her life back. But it seemed kind of weird, but Gary agreed. He's like, "Yeah, I'd rather come stay with you than with some fucking woman, whatever." So they were both staying in a small one-bedroom house in Sequim, Washington, which is very near Port Angeles. And Leslie, who still spoke with Gary daily, of course, said the two seemed to get along great. Patrick wasn't home as much, probably because the space was pretty small, which made his offer all the more generous, seemingly. At one point, Patrick rolled up with a new Chevy Impala, which Gary found weird but kind of impressive. He was like, maybe he's got a sugar mama or like a new job. Like, I don't know. Then, after a month or so of living together, on June 2nd, 2012, Gary was at the house playing World of Warcraft. Patrick was home, but he left to go grab something from the store or to eat. I don't know. He just made some excuse and left. Anyway, right after he left, the power went out, killing the World of Warcraft game and also Gary's ability to talk to other players online because he was doing like the online World of Warcraft where you're like talking to other people. So Gary got up to figure out what happened, and just then, Patrick busts back in the front door holding a 9mm gun. He shot at Gary, but didn't realize it would be so hard to hit him in the dark, so he had to go back out to his car to get more bullets. He had hit Gary, but the wounds were not fatal, and while he went to reload, Gary had time to call 911 and say he was being shot. He did not at any point say it was Patrick shooting him, because I don't think he could tell because it was too dark to see. Now, I don't know for sure, but I think the operator likely heard Patrick come back in and fire the kill shot after getting a mag light from his car. So he went and got a flashlight, came back in the house, found Gary, shot him, and killed him. Gary Blanton was killed with the cell phone still in his hand. Now, Gary had a dog with him. Patrick did not hurt the dog, but he did lock it in another room so it wouldn't interfere with the body. He then left a note titled Declarations on Gary's body. And this note is pretty wild. Uh, I don't have the whole thing, but here are some excerpts. When I was younger, I was at a pet shop. I saw these 3 scorpions in an aquarium. One was a pregnant female and 2 were males. As I approached, the female tucked into a protective ball. The 2 males got in front of her in full battle-ready posture, tails up, claws out, and open. Being young and curious, I played a game and used my hands to circle the aquarium in different directions. Each male picked a hand and moved with it, never leaving her side and staying between her and the hand. This spirit impressed me. It was also signed with his name, Patrick Drum. So I don't even really know what to do with that, but that's a pretty serious fucking note. And in addition to the note, he left a lollipop with a scorpion inside of it. So I don't know if you guys have ever seen those lollipops that have like bugs in them. He left one with this note with the scorpion in it. So very dramatic, very, thought out kind of thing. And from there, Patrick fled in his rental car and went on his way to the home of another man that he deemed worthy of death. This man was 57-year-old Jerry Ray. Now, Jerry Ray was ex-military, had been born and raised in Mississippi, lived in California for a time, and then had settled up in Sequim, Washington. At this time, he was taking care of his ill elderly father. He had also cared for his mother until her death, and he was doing this in part because he had injured his back to the point where he was no longer able to work. So they were all kind of, living on government assistance, but Jerry was being paid to be a caretaker. Now, Jerry had had a pretty rough life and had done some prison time, and we'll talk about that in a minute. At this point, he was struggling with alcoholism, but led a pretty quiet life. He had been married twice and had 3 kids, and his kids, while they did have, a relationship with him and loved him, I wouldn't call them close. So anyway, Patrick shows up to Jerry's house right before, dawn. So it's still like dark out, maybe like twilight, ironically. And he comes up to the door. He's not sure what to do. He wants to kill this man, and we'll talk about why. But he doesn't, he's a little scared. Like the guy used to be in the military. So he goes, he takes a walk to calm his nerves. He tries to think about what to do. Now, when he comes back, the sun has risen. It's now very early morning, but Jerry and his father are probably both still asleep. Patrick had at first considered knocking on the door in the middle of the night and hoping that Jerry would be kind of out of it enough that he wouldn't grab a gun. But again, ex military, middle of the night, most people around there had guns. So instead, he waited until this point in the morning when he thought Jerry would be in a deep sleep, and he just bashed in the front door. He just busted it in and ran out into the house. Now, Jerry came out from his room, heard the commotion, and he said, "What's going on?" Patrick fired his gun and hit Jerry in the stomach. Jerry tried to get back into his room towards the dresser. I don't know if he was gonna what he was gonna do, call the police or grab a gun more likely out of his, bedside table. But he did not have the chance as Patrick shot him again and again. Paul Ray, Jerry's father, was asleep in the room next door, did not even get up. He said, "Oh, I thought it was probably our dogs playing and slamming into the door." So he didn't even realize there was somebody being murdered. Patrick left the same note, the same lollipop on Jerry Ray's body, and then he took off. He got into his rental car, he ditched it in the woods, and took off on foot. Now, part of why Patrick had been gone right before he killed Gary was that he was getting all of his supplies together. Now, he had a plan to stay on the run in the woods using survival gear for as long as possible. And his plan was to kill up to 60 more men while living off of the land. And if we haven't really been able to figure out why yet, we're going to talk about that in a minute. So, anyway, he's out in the woods, but unfortunately for him, Gary, like I said, was able to make that 911 call, and police show up and see that he's been murdered. It's not really clear how long Patrick would have been able to be on the run had Gary not made that call, because in addition to that, Paul Ray, Jerry's father, did get up and found his son and also called the police. But I think both of these things coming in within hours of each other made police know to take this seriously. These weren't like isolated incidents, and they started a manhunt pretty much immediately. Now Patrick, having ditched his rental car for I don't know what reason, decided to hitchhike and got in a car with a man, and they saw one of these checkpoints. There were like 65 cops out. There was border patrol. Like they were taking this very seriously. So while he's in the car with this man he's hitchhiking with, he sees these blockades being set up, and he asks the man to let him out. The man lets him out, and he goes running into the woods. The man, realizing what's going on, immediately tips off police. Now, police are searching the woods for Patrick, and I'm just going to tell you right now, they find him. They find him pretty quickly. They boxed him in. They gave him, two choices basically. Get into the mountains or get caught. And he did try to stay hidden, but even how, like, that's the crazy thing about the Pacific Northwest is, like, even out in the middle of nowhere, somebody lives out there. Somebody who does not want to be fucking bothered or talked to built their house in the middle of nowhere for that purpose. And one of these people saw Patrick and they notified police. So they had a kind of a general location. About 30 minutes later, Border Patrol got him. They tackled him and, got him to the ground, arrested him. So now we have this man who killed two men back to back, had a plan. The police found a list of names, they found all of his gear. He signed the note, so they knew it was him. They knew who they were looking for, but they didn't know why. And this is what we're going to talk about next. Now, like I said, when police caught Patrick, he had a bunch of survival gear on him. He had weapons. He had this list of names. And police were going to have to do the work to figure out who these men were. But luckily, Patrick just pretty much came clean. For all of his faults, he was actually very eloquent. I think he's probably a pretty smart dude. Um, and he was also willing to explain himself. And police later said, he kind of walked with a swagger. He seemed like he expected to be caught. and was not bothered by it whatsoever. So that's interesting to me, to hear that he basically was like, fuck it, I'm going to go to jail forever, but I'm going to take some dudes out. Now, the reason he felt so good about this was he felt very righteous because the men he was taking out, in his mind, harmed children and specifically had sexually assaulted children. Now, with Gary, the 17-year-old feels a little shaky of a reason, but I think between that and him harming his own children, Patrick felt righteous in killing him. So he invited him to live at his house so that he could keep an eye on him. He later admitted that this was part of his plan to watch him, have him right where he wanted him, and essentially, as soon as Gary moved in with him, Patrick put this plan in motion, which to me is fucking crazy. Like, he had been planning this for weeks and was like compiling this list. So totally nuts. So Gary, he killed for abusing his own children and raping a 17-year-old. Jerry, well, you know how I said he mentored two teen boys in particular during his time, mentoring youth? These two had been sexually assaulted by Jerry. They were actually Jerry's grandchildren, and Jerry had done 4 years in prison for stripping them naked and sexually assaulting them. And these boys, years before, had told Patrick about this. And for years, Patrick had been planning how to kill Jerry. He wanted to stab him to death on New Year's in 2005. So it was 7 years in the making that he killed this man. And he did it. I mean, the idea that he's sitting on this for so long before doing it is so wild to me. Like, he went to prison in 2005, and that's why he didn't do it. He did his time. He got a good job. He, took care. I mean, obviously, he took care or was, friends with these kids before they were, he was mentoring them as teens because in 2005 they would have been pretty young. But he was friends with this family. And so when he got out of prison, he, spent time with these teen boys. And during this time, you know, he's planning to fucking kill this guy the whole fucking time. So, anyway, these are all really long in the making. Now, the list of names that Patrick had for the other men were not people that he knew personally. It was like people that he got from like a database. Um, but he was planning on just like cruising around in the woods and popping out at night and murdering these guys. For food, he said he was going to go ahead and just steal from the farms where he had previously worked. He had ammunition, he had a tent, he had sleeping bags. And he said, if I made it as far as the winter, I would just hole up in an abandoned house because even he knew he wouldn't be able to survive a winter in fucking northern Washington. You're going to die if you stay outside. Now, as to why Patrick had decided to attack sex offenders and people who harmed children, you could say, oh, it's just something that he chose to do to be a vigilante. He cared about these kids. But unfortunately for him, it stemmed from a much more personal situation. Now, Patrick's parents were both drug addicts. I want to say that even at 41 years old, having lived, in an area with a lot of drug use growing up, I had never heard of toluene. But apparently, there is a drug epidemic in the Pacific Northwest and even Northern California with this drug. And I don't understand what it is, but it's a solvent, I guess. And Patrick's mother used it while he was in utero. So as a baby, he was, already addicted to this shit. So as he's growing up, he's born with an addiction to two parents with addiction issues. He's left in their care. He's beaten, he's neglected. He one time said his father spit tobacco in his face when he did something wrong. He said his father strangled him unconscious in front of his friends. You know, uh, i- it's really fucked up. But more specifically, he said he can recall the night when he was 6 years old and walked into his living room. His father was on the couch in a night robe, and he saw his father having sex with a young teenage girl. Now, the reason I say having sex with is because his father was later convicted of statutory rape. So, even though he's a disgusting piece of shit, I didn't want to make it sound like forcible rape because that's not what it was. But his father did go to prison for having, essentially raping this teen girl who he probably paid. Beyond that, even more personally, when Patrick was about 10 or 11, he was staying with one of his uncles because God knows he's not going to live at his parents' house forever. He decided to go walking around town by himself at 10 or 11 years old, which, I mean, all of this tracks. He met a man in his 30s and decided to go drink alcohol with this man. And you can guess what happened. The man took him into the woods and forced him to perform oral sex on him, and then performed oral sex on Patrick when Patrick was 10 or 11 years old. So there we have kind of the major underlying motive for why he did what he did. And I think this sat with him for a number of years until he decided to take action. So what it seems like to me is the way that Patrick started out with an addiction, was abused and assaulted his whole young life, started by taking it out on himself by continuing this addiction, and then finally decided to kind of get his life together, but not to be like a good member of the community. He wanted to take out the trash in his own mind. He was wanting to ensure that nobody else was ever hurt the way that he was. And so he went on a rampage trying to kill as many sex offenders as he could. He only got as far as two. And I think a lot of that was due to poor planning, but it is what it is. Patrick was arrested and he went to trial. The prosecution at first did want to pursue the death penalty, but they realized like that was probably not going to happen. Sex offenders do not have the people's pity. And also, Patrick's life, the story I just told you, definitely garnered, sympathy. I feel sympathetic towards him. Um, I think that he presented as a sympathetic character. And there were actually people in the community who very, very much, supported what he did. They were very happy that he was getting rid of the scum in the area, essentially, even if he himself, would have been considered scummy by those same people only 6 months earlier. So, in any case, Patrick was sentenced to life in prison. And the crazy thing is, now that he's in prison, he's still trying to do work to get harsher laws for sex offenders. He does not believe that they can be rehabilitated. There is a lot of evidence to the contrary. Many people who go through like sex offender, therapy and treatments end up not reoffending, at least as far as we know. But to many people, and people like Patrick, that's not good enough. He doesn't understand why a man who sexually assaulted two children under the age of 7 would only get 4 years, and I think to him, having experienced what he experienced in his young life, he doesn't trust the system. Don't blame him. You fucking shouldn't. And he wants to do what he can to change it so that these people are in prison for longer sentences, and that these children in his area and in the world are saved from this abuse. So is this man's heart in the right place? I don't know how to answer that. Like, I see where he's coming from, but I'm not going to go out and murder people. Does it really make you the better person? I don't know. To me, this was a really complicated case, which is kind of why I wanted to cover it. Now that he's in prison, Patrick is a part of the Prison Pen Pal program. He would love to connect with outside people. And he has a website that he maintains called sexdrugsandconsequences.info. From Patrick himself, he says, quote, "Through that site, I am working towards getting lenient sex offender laws changed with the Washington state legislature. A long-term goal I have is to establish a From Prison podcast and speak to bring social awareness to similar laws and situations that exist and occur across the nation." And that pretty much wraps up the case. Yeah, Patrick Drum killing sex offenders and going to prison for the rest of his life. If you guys want more information, I'll link his website, I guess. It's actually interesting. Like I said, he's a pretty smart dude. He's an eloquent writer. It's really sad to me that he had the life that he had and made the decisions that he made, because I really feel like he could have been someone. He could have done something, and instead he just had a horrible life that ended in a double murder. So there it is. There's my Patreon episode. You can tell my voice got a little louder because people started waking up. So I hope you all like it. Thanks so much for listening. Diva and I will be back with full episodes this coming week. And until then, definitely fight sex offenders in your area. Don't do it this way, so you can be sure to stay off our lists. Bye.